They tell you about the trenches and the mud, about poison gas and no man's land, but nobody talks about the iron coffins sliding beneath the waves where 35 men breathed diesel fumes for weeks at a time. You think you know World War I? The war that killed 8.5 million soldiers had another battlefield, one that never saw sunlight, where the enemy wasn't bullets or bayonets, but the steel walls that trapped you 50 feet underwater with the stench of unwashed bodies and the taste of kerosene in every meal you ate. Welcome to life inside a German U-boat, where the casualty rate was higher than any infantry unit, where surviving meant learning to sleep next to a man whose last shower was 3 weeks ago while torpedo tubes leaked battery acid into your lungs. You've heard of the U-boat wolf packs, the submarines that nearly starved Britain into surrender. What you haven't heard is what it cost the men inside. The 20-year-old machinist, who hadn't seen sunlight for 40 days, the torpedo man who slept 6 inches from enough explosive to vaporize everyone aboard, the captain who watched his crew slowly go mad from breathing hydrogen gas leaking from cracked battery cells. These are their stories, the real price of Germany's underwater war. Germany entered 1914 with 20 combat-ready U-boats. 373 would be built before the armistice. 178 were lost by enemy action. 512 officers and 4,894 enlisted men died. But the numbers don't tell you about Johannes Spice waking up every morning with oil coating his nostrils and condensation dripping onto his face from the steel hull above his bunk. The early boats ran on kerosene, not diesel. Kerosene engines that filled every compartment with choking smoke and demanded a huge funnel on the conning tower that made them sitting targets on the surface. The U-9, captained by Otto Wedigen, was typical. 64 meters of cramped steel tube powered by 4 curting paraffin engines that could be coupled in tandem, 2 per propeller shaft, maximum diving depth 50 meters, crew of 35 officers and men, surface speed 14.8 knots, submerged speed 10.7 knots. Diving time 2 minutes and 13 seconds if everything went perfectly. If you value documented submarine warfare history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual. Using sources from the Royal Navy Submarine Museum's archived documents published in Richard Compton Hall's Submarines and the War at Sea 1914 to 1918, Macmillan 1991, and Johannes Spice's first-hand account as first watch officer aboard U-9. Now back to the information. Inside the pressure hull, space was measured in inches. Far forward sat the torpedo room with 2 tubes and 2 reserve torpedoes stacked like giant steel cigars. Behind that, the warrant officers' compartment, small bunks for the quartermaster and machinist. Particularly wet and cold, Spice wrote. Water condensed on the steel hull plates constantly. The temperature inside was always higher than the sea outside, so moisture in the air turned to drops that fell on sleeping faces with every movement of the vessel. Men covered their heads with rain clothes or rubber sheets. It was like sleeping in a damp cellar. The commanding officer's cabin came next. 1 small bunk, 1 closed closet, no desk. Whenever a torpedo needed loading or a tube prepared for firing, both the warrant officers and commanding officers' cabins had to be completely cleared. Bunks and clothes cabinets moved into the adjacent officer's compartment. No light task, Spice noted, owing to lack of space. The officer's compartment doubled as the boat's dining room. 1 folding table between 2 small upholstered seats, 2 folding camp chairs. When the commanding officer and watch officer and chief engineer ate their meals, crew members had to pass back and forth through the boat. Each time someone passed, the table folded up. Privacy didn't exist. Meals were interrupted constantly by men squeezing through the only passage between bow and stern. Further aft, a watertight bulkhead separated the crew space from the officers. Round watertight door for passage. The crew compartment had bunks for only a few men. The rest slept in hammocks when not on watch. A small electric range was supposed to serve for cooking, but the heating coil and oven short-circuited constantly. Meals were always prepared on deck using a small paraffin stove borrowed from Norwegian fishing vessels, even in high winds. It was the only reliable way to heat food. Below the crew space ran rows of storage battery cells filled with sulfuric acid and distilled water. These powered the electric motors for submerged operations. They generated hydrogen gas during charging and discharging. Ventilation systems drew the gas out, but if ventilation failed, the boat could explode. Several German submarines were lost this way. If seawater got into the battery cells, chlorine gas formed, poisonous, deadly. From a hygiene standpoint, Spice wrote, the sleeping arrangements left much to be desired. Men woke each morning with considerable mucus in their nostrils and what he called oil head. The kerosene fumes penetrated everything. Food tasted like fuel oil. Clothes reeked of petroleum. After 12 hours submerged, The air became so foul that Spice understood why his predecessor recommended opium for cruises lasting more than half a day. The central control station sat behind another watertight bulkhead, gyro compass, depth rudder controls to keep the boat at required depth, similar to a Zeppelin's altitude control, bilge pumps, electric blowers for clearing and filling diving tanks, air compressors, and in one small corner, a toilet screened by a curtain, one toilet for 35 men. Engine room housed the 4 kerosene engines. When running on the surface, they generated enormous heat and filled the boat with toxic fumes. The demountable funnel carried away some smoke, but crew members still breathed a cocktail of engine exhaust, fuel vapors, and human sweat. Charts rotted from the humidity. Mildew grew on shoes and clothes. Everything metal that could rust did rust. Hot bunking was standard. 2 men shared each bunk on rotating shifts. When one man finished his 8-hour watch, his bunkmate climbed into the still warm bedding. No time for the mattress to cool. No change of sheets. The man going off duty brought with him the sweat and grime of 8 hours operating machinery or standing watch in the conning tower. Watch schedules ran in 3 shifts. 8 hours on duty, 8 hours for sleeping, 8 hours for maintenance, cleaning weapons, checking equipment, and the dozen small tasks that kept the boat operational. But sleep rarely came easily. The boat pitched and rolled on the surface. When submerged, every sound carried: the hum of electric motors, the ping of the hull contracting under pressure, the whisper of compressed air bleeding from valves, the snores of exhausted men. Water was strictly rationed. Fresh water came from a small distillation unit that could produce perhaps 20 gallons per day in good conditions. This had to cover drinking water for 35 men, cooking, and battery maintenance. No water for washing clothes or bodies, no showers, no laundry. Men wore the same underwear and socks for weeks. Deodorant was the only defense against body odor that intensified daily. Food storage presented constant challenges. Every available space was crammed with provisions: tinned meat, preserved vegetables, dried potatoes, hardtack biscuits, coffee and beer when available. One of the toilets served as a pantry until supplies were consumed. Then it could be used for its intended purpose, giving the crew 2 functioning lavatories instead of 1. The galley was barely large enough for one man to stand. Cooks maintained accurate counts of every pound of food consumed and its exact storage location within the boat. This helped maintain the submarine's trim as provisions were eaten and weight distribution changed. Fresh bread lasted 3 days. After that, hard biscuits and tinned rations. Vegetables spoiled quickly in the humid air. Meat turned green unless eaten immediately. Loading provisions before a patrol meant cramming food into every possible space: under bunks, between pipes, in corners where men would later try to sleep. A 2-week patrol required tons of supplies for 35 men. Longer patrols meant even less living space as more food was packed aboard. Medical care was primitive: no doctor, no medical equipment beyond basic first aid supplies. The most common injuries were cuts from sharp metal edges, burns from hot machinery, and respiratory problems from breathing polluted air. Serious injuries or illness meant surfacing and running for the nearest friendly port, abandoning the patrol. Accidents happened constantly in the cramped spaces. Men struck their heads on low pipes. Fingers were crushed between heavy equipment. Burns from scalding water or steam were common. Electric shock from exposed wiring. Chemical burns from battery acid. Every injury was magnified by the inability to properly clean wounds in the polluted environment. Temperature control was impossible. On the surface, in winter, the boat was freezing. Crew members huddled in the engine room for warmth, but the noise was deafening. In summer, especially in tropical waters, temperatures inside could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men worked in minimal clothing, often just underwear and shoes. Ventilation was minimal when submerged, making hot weather patrols nearly unbearable. Clothing rotted in the constant humidity. Shoes grew mildew, leather belts cracked, metal buckles rusted, uniforms stank of diesel fuel, sweat, and human waste. After weeks at sea, crew members' clothes were literally falling apart. Patches upon patches held together what remained of their original uniforms. Mental strain was as bad as physical hardship. 35 men trapped in a steel tube for weeks created inevitable conflicts. Arguments over trivial matters. Fights in spaces so small that bystanders couldn't avoid being involved. Depression from never seeing sunlight. Paranoia from constantly listening for enemy ships. Some men suffered what would later be recognized as claustrophobia-induced panic attacks. The psychological pressure of knowing that a single torpedo hit, depth charges, or ramming would kill everyone aboard affected every crew member differently. Some became reckless, taking unnecessary risks. Others became paralyzed with fear, unable to function during combat. The lucky ones found ways to focus on their duties and push the fear aside. Sleep deprivation was constant. Even during rest periods, the noise and motion of the boat made real sleep difficult. Men grabbed naps whenever possible. But 8 hours of quality sleep was rare. Exhaustion made everything worse. Mistakes in navigation, errors in equipment operation, poor judgment in combat situations. Communication with the surface world was limited to brief radio transmissions. Families at home had no idea whether their husbands or sons were alive or dead. Crew members went weeks without news from home. Letters were impossible. The isolation was complete and psychologically devastating. Entertainment was limited to whatever men could carry in their small personal lockers. Playing cards were popular, but space for games was minimal. Some boats carried phonographs with a few records, but mechanical equipment was unreliable in the humid environment. Most entertainment consisted of conversation, storytelling, and crude jokes that helped maintain morale. Promotion and recognition were rare. Junior ratings could spend months in the same cramped compartments with no hope of advancement. Officers had slightly better accommodations, but faced far greater responsibility for keeping the boat and crew alive. Success in combat meant surviving to fight again. Failure meant death for everyone. Discipline was strict, but necessarily different from surface ships. Court-martial was impossible at sea. Serious disciplinary problems were rare. The shared danger created strong bonds between crew members. Minor infractions were handled by extra duty assignments or reduction in already meager privileges. The early war period saw U-boats operating under prize rules. Surface, stop merchant ships, allow crews to abandon ship before sinking the vessel. This exposed the submarine to counterattack and was soon abandoned in favor of unrestricted submarine warfare. Torpedoing without warning from concealed positions. Training for U-boat service was minimal in the early war years. Germany had only 20 operational submarines when fighting began. Experienced submariners were rare. New crew members learned on the job. Often during their first combat patrol, mistakes could be fatal for the entire crew. Navigation underwater was primitive. No GPS, no modern sonar. Dead reckoning based on compass courses and estimated speeds. Periscope observations, when safe, to expose it. Surface navigation by stars when possible. Getting lost was easy. Finding friendly ports after weeks at sea required considerable skill and luck. Combat effectiveness varied enormously between boats and crews. The most successful U-boat of World War I was U-35, which sank 224 ships, most of these under a single commander, Lothar von Arnold de la Perrière. Other boats sank only a few ships during their entire service. Success depended on crew skill, equipment reliability, and luck. Torpedo reliability was a constant problem. Early torpedoes often failed to explode on impact. Compressed air propulsion left visible wakes that alerted targets. Magnetic detonators were unreliable. Depth settings were frequently incorrect. Many attacks failed because torpedoes malfunctioned, wasting precious ammunition and exposing the submarine to counterattack. Maintenance of complex machinery in cramped, humid conditions was nearly impossible. Tools rusted. Spare parts were difficult to store. Repairs required dismantling equipment in spaces barely large enough for the machinery itself. Mechanical failures could strand a submarine on the surface or underwater, often with fatal results. Loading and firing torpedoes required the entire crew's coordination. Torpedoes weighed over 2,000 pounds each. Moving them through the narrow boat required careful planning and teamwork. Loading a torpedo into a tube was a complex, dangerous process that could take 30 minutes or more. During this time, the submarine was vulnerable and unable to dive quickly. Surface attacks using the deck gun were common, especially against merchant ships. The gun crew had to reach the deck, remove the waterproof covering, load ammunition, and begin firing while the submarine remained on the surface and exposed. Rough seas made deck operations dangerous. Enemy escort vessels made them potentially fatal. Diving procedures had to be executed flawlessly. Ballast tanks flooded, hydroplanes adjusted. Air vented from tanks to reduce buoyancy, all hatches sealed. The process took over 2 minutes in the best conditions. Enemy aircraft or ships could attack during this vulnerable period. A diving accident could trap the boat on the surface or send it to the bottom with all hands. Emergency surface procedures were equally critical. Blow ballast tanks with compressed air, adjust trim to break surface quickly, prepare to abandon ship if necessary. Surface emergencies were often caused by fire, flooding, or toxic gas leaks that made remaining submerged impossible. Fire aboard a submarine was every crew member's worst nightmare. No way to escape. Limited firefighting equipment. Flames consumed precious oxygen and created toxic smoke. Electrical fires from the battery compartment were particularly dangerous, often accompanied by chlorine gas that could kill the entire crew. Flooding was equally terrifying. Seawater entering the boat upset trim and buoyancy. It could short out electrical systems, contaminate battery compartments to produce poison gas, or simply overwhelm pumping capacity and sink the boat. Small leaks could become major flooding in minutes. Battery explosions from hydrogen gas accumulation destroyed several German submarines. The gas was odorless and invisible. Ventilation systems had to function perfectly. But mechanical failures were common. A single spark could detonate accumulated gas, blowing the boat apart instantly. Abandoning a submarine underwater was impossible with the technology of 1914 to 1918. No escape apparatus, no emergency breathing equipment. If the boat sank beyond periscope depth, everyone died. Surface abandonment in rough seas was nearly as dangerous. Life rafts were minimal. Survival time in cold North Sea water was measured in minutes. Medical emergencies underwater created impossible situations: appendicitis, heart attacks, serious injuries from accidents, no way to evacuate casualties, no surgical facilities, no trained medical personnel. Men died from conditions that would have been treatable in surface hospitals. Communication failures cut submarines off from their bases for weeks at a time. Radio equipment was unreliable. Antennas could be damaged by weather or enemy action. Coded messages were often garbled or incomplete. Submarines operated independently for extended periods, with no guidance from higher command. Fuel consumption calculations were critical for survival. Running out of diesel while submerged meant relying entirely on battery power, which was limited to perhaps 10 hours of operation. Surfacing to run engines exposed the boat to enemy attack. Fuel management required constant attention to consumption rates, weather conditions, and mission requirements. Weather played a decisive role in submarine operations. Storms could damage the conning tower or sweep crew members overboard. Heavy seas made surface operations dangerous and submerged operations uncomfortable. Fog provided concealment but made navigation nearly impossible. Ice in northern waters could trap submarines on the surface or damage hull plating. Enemy countermeasures evolved rapidly during the war. Depth charges were introduced in 1916. By 1917, they had sunk dozens of German submarines. Q ships disguised as merchant vessels lured submarines into surface attacks, then revealed hidden guns. Convoy systems made targets harder to find and attack effectively. Aircraft became increasingly effective anti-submarine weapons as the war progressed. Flying boats and land-based patrol aircraft could spot submerged submarines in shallow water. Bombing and strafing attacks on surface submarines became common. Air cover for convoys made submarine attacks much more dangerous. Mining of submarine transit routes claimed many U-boats. The Dover Barrage attempted to block passage between the English Channel and North Sea. The northern barrage between Scotland and Norway was laid by American and British forces in 1918. Mines were invisible until they exploded against a submarine's hull. Intelligence warfare played a crucial role. British cryptographers broke German naval codes, allowing them to predict submarine movements. Direction-finding equipment located submarines by their radio transmissions. Captured German submariners provided information about tactics, equipment, and base locations. Submarine bases became primary targets for enemy bombers. Ostend, Thijs, Zeebrugge, and other Belgian ports were repeatedly attacked. Repair facilities were bombed, fuel depots destroyed, personnel killed or wounded. Base security required significant resources that could have been used elsewhere. Crew rotation was limited by the small number of trained submariners. Men served consecutive patrols with minimal rest between deployments. Physical and mental exhaustion accumulated over months of service. Some crew members served continuously from 1914 until the armistice, never spending more than a few weeks ashore. The psychological toll of submarine warfare extended beyond individual crew members. Families lived in constant fear of losing husbands, sons, and brothers to an invisible enemy beneath the waves. No notification of death was possible until submarines failed to return from patrol. Uncertainty lasted for weeks or months. Technical innovations improved submarine effectiveness, but often at the cost of crew comfort. Larger batteries provided longer submerged endurance, but took up space previously used for living quarters. More powerful engines increased surface speed, but generated more heat and toxic fumes. Additional torpedoes meant less room for food and personal belongings. International law governing submarine warfare was primitive and rapidly overtaken by technological developments. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant vessels became blurred when merchant ships carried military supplies and defensive armament. Prize rules became impractical when submarines faced immediate counterattack after surfacing. War crimes allegations against submarine commanders were common but difficult to prosecute. Survivors of torpedoed ships often reported machine gun attacks on lifeboats, though these accounts were frequently contradictory or unverifiable. The isolation of submarine warfare made independent verification of incidents nearly impossible. Propaganda uses of submarine warfare were extensive on both sides. Allied newspapers portrayed U-boat commanders as murderers of innocent civilians. German press celebrated submarine victories as heroic achievements against overwhelming enemy naval superiority. Both versions contained elements of truth and exaggeration. Post-war analysis revealed the enormous cost of submarine warfare relative to strategic gains achieved. Germany lost 178 submarines and over 5,000 crew members. Allied shipping losses, while significant were replaced by new construction, and did not force Britain out of the war. The entry of the United States into the conflict was partly caused by German submarine attacks on American vessels. Economic analysis showed that submarine construction consumed resources that could have been used more effectively elsewhere. Each U-boat required months to build and crew with highly trained specialists. The same steel and skilled workers could have produced tanks, artillery, or aircraft that might have had greater impact on the land war. Technological development accelerated during the submarine war, but often produced equipment too late to affect the outcome. Improved torpedoes, better batteries, more reliable engines, and enhanced underwater detection systems were introduced in the final months of the war when Germany was already facing defeat. The human cost extended beyond military casualties to include merchant seamen, passengers on torpedoed ships, and in civilians in coastal areas subjected to submarine attacks. Total deaths from submarine warfare numbered in the tens of thousands, making it one of the most lethal aspects of World War I naval combat. Strategic failures of the U-boat campaign became evident as the war progressed. Despite sinking over 11 million gross register tons of Allied shipping, Britain's maritime supply lines remained functional. The convoy system, introduced in August 1917, reduced monthly shipping losses from over 500,000 tons to 300,000 tons. Not enough to force capitulation, training replacement crews became increasingly difficult as experienced submariners were killed or captured. By 1918, many U-boats sailed with crews containing more novices than veterans. Training accidents increased. Combat effectiveness declined. New commanders lacked the experience of early war aces, who had learned submarine warfare through trial and error. Social dynamics aboard submarines reflected broader German military culture, but were modified by the unique stresses of underwater warfare. Officer-enlisted relationships were more informal than on surface ships due to shared dangers and cramped living conditions. However, strict military hierarchy was maintained for operational effectiveness. Regional differences among crew members sometimes created tensions. Prussian officers commanded boats crewed by Bavarians, Saxons, or sailors from other German states. Religious differences between Protestant and Catholic crew members occasionally caused conflicts, especially during extended patrols when stress levels were highest. Age demographics of submarine crews differed significantly from other military branches. Most crew members were in their early 20s, chosen for physical stamina and adaptability to confined spaces. Older sailors often struggled with the physical demands of submarine service. Very young sailors sometimes panicked under pressure. Marriage and family considerations affected crew morale significantly. Single men often adapted better to submarine life, while married sailors with children suffered more from separation anxiety. Mail from home could boost morale dramatically or cause severe depression, depending on its contents. Bad news from home sometimes led to requests for transfer. Financial compensation for submarine service was higher than for surface ships, reflecting the increased danger and hardship. However, opportunities to spend money were limited during long patrols. Many submariners saved most of their pay, creating nest eggs for post-war life that few would survive to enjoy. Leave periods between patrols were typically brief, often only a few days. Crew members had little time to readjust to normal life before returning to sea. Some developed difficulty relating to civilians who couldn't understand their experiences. Others became dependent on alcohol to cope with stress. Veteran submariners developed distinctive psychological profiles. Heightened alertness, ability to function in confined spaces, strong bonds with fellow crew members, difficulty trusting anyone outside their immediate submarine family. Many showed symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Technical evolution of U-boat design accelerated throughout the war. Early kerosene-powered boats like U-9 were replaced by diesel-powered vessels with greater range, speed, and reliability. Type U-19 introduced diesel engines in 1912. Surface speed increased to 16 knots. Diving time decreased to less than 60 seconds. Weapon systems evolved from simple torpedo tubes to complex fire control systems. Deck guns increased in caliber and effectiveness. Mine-laying submarines carried up to 42 mines in specialized tubes. Some boats were converted to cargo carriers for blockade running missions to neutral ports. Detection and countermeasure technology advanced rapidly on both sides. Hydrophone systems allowed submarines to detect surface ships by their propeller noise. However, the same technology enabled enemy ships to locate submarines by their engine sounds. Electronic warfare began in its primitive form. Operational doctrine shifted from individual hunting to coordinated wolfpack tactics late in the war. Multiple submarines would attack convoy formations simultaneously, overwhelming escort vessels and sinking more merchant ships. However, coordination required radio communication that exposed submarine positions to enemy direction-finding equipment. Base infrastructure development was crucial to submarine effectiveness. Forward bases on the Belgian coast reduced transit time to hunting grounds around the British Isles. Maintenance facilities, fuel depots, torpedo storage, and crew accommodations required significant resources and were vulnerable to enemy bombing. Intelligence gathering became increasingly sophisticated. Neutral ports provided information about Allied shipping movements. German agents in enemy countries reported convoy departures and routes. However, Allied intelligence services were equally active, often providing advance warning of submarine attacks. Supply chain challenges affected submarine operations significantly. Torpedoes required specialized manufacturing facilities that were targeted by Allied bombers. Diesel fuel had to be transported to forward bases through war zones. Replacement parts for complex machinery were often unavailable when needed most. Industrial mobilization for submarine construction strained Germany's wartime economy. Submarine yards competed with other military priorities for steel, skilled workers, and manufacturing equipment. As the war continued, resource shortages forced compromises in construction quality that affected operational reliability. Prisoner of war treatment for captured submariners was complicated by the nature of submarine warfare. Many Allied officials considered U-boat crews to be war criminals rather than legitimate prisoners of war. However, international law required proper treatment, and most captured German submariners were treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Escape and evasion procedures for submarine crews were minimal. If a boat was forced to surface in enemy waters, crew members had few options for avoiding capture. Scuttling procedures were designed to prevent submarines from falling into enemy hands, but this often meant crew members had to abandon ship in hostile waters. Medical evacuation from submarines was impossible except by surfacing and transferring casualties to other vessels. This exposed the entire crew to enemy attack for the sake of one injured person. Difficult decisions had to be made about whether to risk the boat and 34 other lives to save one crew member. Morale maintenance required constant attention from officers. Success in combat boosted crew confidence. While failed attacks or near misses by enemy depth charges could cause panic, experienced commanders developed techniques for keeping their men focused on duties rather than dwelling on dangers. Weather forecasting was primitive, and submarines often encountered unexpected storms that made operations dangerous or impossible. Surface operations in high seas could wash crew members overboard or damage equipment. Submerged operations during storms caused severe discomfort and made navigation difficult. Navigation accuracy was crucial for survival, but difficult to maintain with available technology. Compass errors could cause submarines to surface in enemy waters or run aground in shallow areas. Dead reckoning calculations accumulated errors over time. Especially during extended submerged periods, fuel management required careful calculation of consumption rates versus mission requirements. Running out of fuel while submerged meant death for the entire crew. Conservative fuel usage limited operational effectiveness, but increased survival chances. Aggressive tactics risked fuel exhaustion far from base. Maintenance schedules had to be adapted to combat conditions. Routine repairs that required hours of work had to be completed during brief surface periods when the boat was vulnerable to attack. Critical systems often operated beyond their design limits, increasing the likelihood of catastrophic failures. Communication protocols with base headquarters were limited by primitive radio equipment and the need to maintain radio silence to avoid detection. Submarines often operated for weeks without contact, making strategic coordination difficult and preventing tactical adjustments based on changing conditions. Enemy shipping patterns changed throughout the war in response to submarine threats. Convoy routes were altered frequently. Sailing schedules became irregular. Neutral vessels avoided known submarine patrol areas. These adaptations made targets harder to find and attack effectively. International diplomatic complications arose from submarine attacks on neutral shipping. The United States protested vigorously against German submarine warfare, eventually leading to America's entry into the war. Other neutral nations also filed protests, creating diplomatic pressure that limited submarine operations. Technical failures could occur at any moment and often proved fatal. Battery explosions from gas accumulation killed entire crews instantly. Diesel engine failures left boats stranded on the surface. Hull fractures from pressure or collision caused rapid flooding. Emergency procedures existed but weren't always effective. Crew selection criteria evolved as submarine warfare experience accumulated. Physical fitness was essential for operating in confined spaces. Mental stability was crucial for withstanding psychological pressure. Technical competence was required for maintaining complex equipment. Few men met all requirements. Training programs were established to produce qualified submarine personnel more quickly than on-the-job learning allowed. However, classroom instruction could not replicate the actual conditions of submarine warfare. Real competence came only through experience, which many crew members did not survive to gain. Submarine doctrine continued to evolve throughout the war based on operational experience. Early emphasis on attacking warships shifted to commerce warfare against merchant vessels. Surface attacks using deck guns were replaced by submerged torpedo attacks. Individual operations gave way to coordinated campaigns. Logistical support for submarine operations was complex and vulnerable. Fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts had to be transported to forward bases through contested waters. Enemy attacks on supply lines could leave submarines unable to continue operations, even if they were undamaged. Casualty replacement became increasingly difficult as the war progressed and losses mounted. Experienced petty officers and technicians could not be quickly replaced. Training new personnel required months, during which submarines operated below full effectiveness. Some boats sailed with incomplete crews rather than waiting for replacements. Post-mission analysis revealed the enormous risks submarine crews accepted for relatively modest strategic gains. Individual boats might sink dozens of merchant ships during successful careers, but the overall impact on Allied logistics was manageable through increased production and more efficient convoy operations. Psychological warfare aspects of submarine operations affected both sides. Fear of submarine attack caused Allied merchant seamen to demand higher wages and created a reluctance to sail in dangerous waters. However, submarine crews also suffered from knowing they were among the most hated enemies, subject to immediate execution if captured under certain circumstances. Technical innovation in submarine warfare accelerated rapidly during World War I, but was often too late to affect outcomes. Improved batteries, better torpedoes, more reliable engines, and enhanced underwater detection systems entered service just as Germany was losing the war and could not benefit from these advances. Medical care aboard submarines was primitive even by World War I standards. No doctors, minimal medical equipment, no surgical facilities. Crew members with serious injuries or illnesses usually died unless the boat could reach port quickly. Minor injuries often became infected due to unsanitary conditions. Abandonment procedures were practiced but rarely successful when actually needed. Life rafts were minimal and difficult to launch in combat conditions. Survival in cold North Atlantic waters was measured in minutes rather than hours. Rescue by friendly forces was unlikely in contested waters. Social relationships within submarine crews were intensified by shared dangers and confined living spaces. Close friendships developed quickly, but personality conflicts could become explosive. Officers had to manage interpersonal dynamics carefully to maintain crew effectiveness and prevent violence in confined spaces. Entertainment and recreational activities were severely limited by space constraints and operational requirements. Card games were popular when space permitted. Some boats carried musical instruments or phonographs, but mechanical equipment often failed in humid conditions. Most entertainment consisted of conversation and storytelling. Submarine operations in different theaters of war presented unique challenges. North Sea operations dealt with rough weather and intensive enemy patrols. Mediterranean operations faced clearer water that made submarines more visible, but warmer conditions that improved crew comfort. Each theater required different tactics and equipment. Intelligence value of submarine operations extended beyond simple ship sinking. Submarines could observe enemy naval movements, report convoy routes and schedules, and land agents in enemy territory. However, intelligence gathering required radio communication that exposed submarine positions to enemy direction-finding equipment. Economic warfare effectiveness was limited by submarine numbers and Allied countermeasures. Germany never had enough operational submarines to completely cut Britain's maritime supply lines. Allied shipbuilding increased throughout the war, eventually replacing losses faster than submarines could sink ships. Technological countermeasures developed by the Allies included depth charges, submarine nets, minefields, and escort vessels with underwater detection equipment. Each countermeasure forced adaptations in submarine tactics and operations, creating a continuous cycle of measure and countermeasure throughout the war. International law regarding submarine warfare was primitive and rapidly overtaken by technological capabilities. Traditional prize rules required surface inspection of merchant vessels before sinking, but this exposed submarines to counterattack. Unrestricted submarine warfare violated international law, but was militarily more effective. War crimes, accusations against submarine commanders were common, but difficult to prove. Survivors of torpedoed ships often reported machine gun attacks on lifeboats, but these accounts were frequently contradictory. The isolation of submarine operations made independent verification of incidents nearly impossible. Strategic bombing of submarine bases became a priority for Allied air forces. Ports like Austin and Zeebrugge were repeatedly attacked to destroy repair facilities and submarine pens. However, these attacks had limited success due to heavily reinforced construction and rapid repair capabilities. Submarine crew casualties represented some of the highest loss rates of any military branch during World War I. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in German submarines during the war, over 5,000 were killed. This casualty rate of more than 12% was exceeded only by infantry units in the most intense battles. In the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London, a single photograph captures the reality better than any statistics. Taken in November 1918 at Harwich, it shows 160 surrendered U-boats moored in neat rows, empty steel hulls that once held the dreams and nightmares of thousands of young German sailors. The photograph doesn't show what happened to the men who sailed those boats, of the 512 officers killed. Many were experienced commanders whose loss crippled German submarine effectiveness. Of the 4,894 enlisted men who died, most were barely old enough to vote. They joined expecting adventure and found horror. Johannes Speiss survived the war. His captain, Otto Weddigen, did not. Weddigen died in March 1915 when U-29 was rammed by HMS Dreadnought. His body was never recovered. The man who sank 3 British cruisers in less than an hour became another casualty of the war he helped escalate. U-9 herself survived until November 1918, relegated to training duties after her kerosene engines became obsolete. She trained new crews who would die in more modern boats with diesel engines and better weapons, but the same fundamental problem: 35 men trapped in a steel coffin beneath an ocean that wanted to kill them. The final tally speaks for itself. Germany built 373 submarines during World War I. 178 were destroyed by enemy action. Another 14 were scuttled by their own crews. 122 surrendered intact. The underwater war that promised to strangle Britain ended with German submarines surrendering at British ports. But the real cost wasn't measured in tons of steel or tactical victories. It was measured in the men who never came home. The 20-year-old machinist from Hamburg who suffocated when chlorine gas leaked from cracked battery cells. The torpedo man from Munich who drowned when depth charges ruptured the pressure hull. The radio operator from Berlin who went mad from breathing hydrogen gas and jumped overboard during a surface attack. Their names are carved on memorials in German ports, but their stories died with them in the depths of the North Sea and Mediterranean. What we know comes from survivors like Johannes Speiss, who wrote his account not to glorify submarine warfare, but to record the truth about what it cost the men who fought it. The lesson isn't about tactics or strategy. It's about the price of sending young men to war in machines designed to kill them along with their enemies. Every technological advancement in submarine warfare, longer range, deeper diving, more powerful weapons, came at the expense of crew comfort and safety. The boats got better. The men inside still suffered. By Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, the German submarine fleet that had terrorized Allied shipping was finished, not because they ran out of boats or torpedoes, but because they ran out of trained men willing to climb into steel coffins and slide beneath the waves, knowing they probably wouldn't return. The surrendered U-boats at Harwich were studied, scrapped, or distributed to Allied navies as war prizes. None returned to German service. But the lessons learned in their cramped compartments, from the experience of men like Johannes Speiss breathing kerosene fumes and sleeping in damp hammocks, would inform submarine design for decades to come. Today, nuclear submarines carry crews of over 100 men in spaces larger than entire World War I boats. Air purification systems eliminate toxic gases. Distillation plants provide unlimited fresh water. Climate control maintains comfortable temperatures. Hot food is available around the clock. Privacy is still limited, but men have individual bunks and personal space. Yet, submarine service remains one of the most psychologically demanding military assignments. The fundamental challenge hasn't changed. Isolating men underwater for extended periods while asking them to operate complex, dangerous machinery in an environment that can kill them instantly if anything goes wrong. The steel walls are thicker now. The air is cleaner. The food tastes better. But the ocean still wants to kill you, and there's still nowhere to run. The archives at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum contain Johannes Speiss's original handwritten account, carefully preserved in acid-free storage. His description of waking up with oil in his nostrils and condensation dripping on his face reminds us that behind every strategic analysis of submarine warfare effectiveness, behind every statistic about tonnage sunk and vessels lost, were individual human beings trying to survive in conditions that no one should have to endure. But they did endure it. For 4 years, German submariners climbed through narrow hatches into steel tubes that smelled of diesel fuel and human waste, knowing that their chances of survival decreased with every patrol. They did it because their country asked them to. They did it because their crews depended on them. They did it because someone had to. The final German submarine surrendered at Harwich carried a crew that had been at sea for 6 weeks. When they climbed out of their boat for the last time, British naval personnel noted that the men could barely walk. Their legs were weak from confinement. Their skin was pale from lack of sunlight. Their clothes were rotting rags. They stank of fuel oil and unwashed bodies. They were also some of the luckiest men in the German Navy. They had survived submarine service in World War I. 5,000 of their comrades had not. In the end, that's the real story of life aboard German U-boats in World War I, not the tactical successes or strategic failures, but the human cost of fighting a war beneath the surface of the ocean in machines that were as likely to kill their own crews as the enemy. The men who served in those boats paid the price for Germany's attempt to win the war at sea. Most of them paid with their lives. The kerosene smoke has long since cleared from the archives where Johannes Speiss's account is preserved, but his words remain a testament to the men who descended into the depths and never returned. Their sacrifice changed naval warfare forever, but the price they paid should never be forgotten.